My name is Shlomo or Solly Angel, and I am a professor of city planning at the Marron Institute of Urban Management at New York University. My presentation today is titled 12 Guidelines for Action on Urban Expansion. It is a recorded version of largely the same presentation I gave at the World Bank on the 7th of March 2024 at the 8th Urbanization and Poverty Conference, which was titled Urban Expansion and the Future of Cities. This presentation should be of interest to any person, whether a professional or a layman, concerned about the fate of cities in the Global South that wants to do something proactive about urban expansion rather than complain about it or oppose it in principle. I summarize here what I have learned over the years in 12 guidelines for action that can be undertaken now before urbanization largely comes to an end in the Global South, as it already has in large measure in the Global North. I shall first enumerate these guidelines for action one by one. I shall then provide some evidence in support of these guidelines, evidence that I believe can empower and encourage those willing to take concrete action on urban expansion. This evidence takes the form of both theoretical and empirical findings from past and more recent research, of successful examples, both recent and historical, of good practice, and of illustrative examples of bad practice as well. At the end of the day, the proactive engagement with urban expansion relies on making a solid case for it, on assembling powerful coalitions for putting it into practice, and on empowering those that can do something about it on the ground in cities everywhere. Here then are the 12 guidelines. Guideline 1. Come to an understanding that urbanization results in urban expansion, and that expansion is both global, namely that it has happened and will happen in all cities in all countries, and local, namely that it has happened and will happen in your city as well. Guideline 2. Understand and be able to explain that the two main forces that drive urban expansion are population growth and income growth, and that urban expansion cannot be contained by policies and plans, however well-meaning or draconian they may be. Guideline 3. Come to terms with the fact that cities accommodate their added populations both by densification and by expansion, and that the two are complementary, not exclusive, and that most population growth is accommodated by expansion, not by densification. Guideline 4. Acknowledge and convince others that while densification is greener than expansion, the challenge is not to replace urban expansion by densification, but to make urban expansion green, while ensuring that it is productive and inclusive as well. Guideline 5. Come to terms with the fact that unplanned and disorderly expansion is undesirable. It compromises the productivity, inclusiveness, sustainability, and resilience of cities, and it makes it more difficult and more expensive to attend to these issues later. Guideline 6. Understand that planned urban expansion can best be accomplished by empowering local officials and stakeholders to plan and implement expansion themselves, and not by plans made by outsiders and left for locals to implement. Guideline 7. Empower local officials and stakeholders to prepare for planned urban expansion by first making realistic projections of the amount of land needed to accommodate the growth in population and income in the coming decades, preferably for 30 years. Guideline 8. Because projecting too little land will result in costly unplanned expansion, while preparing too much land will cost little if preparations are minimal, advocate for earning on the side of projecting more rather than less land for expansion. Guideline 9. Help the city identify the lands on the urban periphery that are suitable for expansion, ensuring that drainage channels, steep slopes, low-lying areas subject to sea level rise, and important environmental assets can be protected from development. Guideline 10. Help plan and mark the rights-of-way on the ground for an arterial road grid throughout the projected expansion area, 30-meter wide roads, 1 kilometer apart, that can carry public transport, that are within women's walking distance, and that connect workers to jobs. Guideline 11. Reform zoning and land use regulations to allow for green urban expansion, permitting high-density transit-oriented corridors along arterial roads, mixed use within macro blocks, smaller plots, and higher plot coverage, and requiring neighborhood greens. Guideline 12. Promote and empower rural councils and rural landowners to implement land pooling and subdivision within the macro blocks of the arterial road grid to reduce demand for informal settlement, capture the increased land value without compulsory acquisition, and provide large numbers of minimally serviced affordable plots. I shall now move on to present some evidence, some explanations, and some examples in support of these 12 guidelines for action. The first one says, urbanization is translated into urban expansion. Together with colleagues, we created animations of the historical expansion of a group of 30 representative cities during the past 2 centuries, using historical maps for earlier periods and satellite imageries for later ones. Here's the animation for Paris. Between 1800 and 2014, the population of Paris increased 22-fold, while its area expanded 220-fold. Here's a map of Cuenca, Ecuador, showing its expansion from 1989 to 2021. These maps should convince you that urban expansion is real and in many places quite substantial and rather inevitable. I move on to the second guideline. Urban expansion cannot be contained. We first note that when we model the urban extents of cities as a dependent variable in a regression, more than 80% of the variation in urban extents is explained by their populations and their per capita incomes. Very little remains to be explained by variations in policy among them. That said, there's a long history of trying to contain outward urban expansion, starting with Queen Elizabeth I, who banned construction within 3 miles of the City of London in 1580. Containment is indeed on the books in many cities, that is, in official vision statements and master plans that have no statutory authority and are not enforced. In many other cities, good intentions coupled with weak efforts at enforcement have simply failed. I focus here briefly on 2 examples of failed containment: the Greenbelt of Tokyo, Japan, and of Beijing, China. This map shows the abandoned 1941 Greenbelt in Tokyo superimposed on its built-up urban extent in 2014. The area within this abandoned Greenbelt is 450 square kilometers. The area of Tokyo in 2014 was 14 times larger, 6,400 plus square kilometers. The fate of the Greenbelt of Beijing, China, is shown in this map. The red area in this map is the area within Beijing's 2003 officially designated Greenbelt, the area within the light blue boundary that has been built upon by 2016. I move on to the third guideline. Most population growth is accommodated by expansion, not by densification. Urban population growth is typically accommodated in 3 ways: infill and building upwards, which we refer to as densification, and outward expansion. In a study titled Densify and Expand, my colleagues and I used data on a stratified global sample of 200 cities, and we asked the following question: what share of the population added to cities between 1990 and 2014 was accommodated within their 1990 footprints, and what share was accommodated within their expansion areas? The answer was 1/4 was accommodated within their 1990 footprints and 3/4 in their expansion areas. A more recent study of 70 cities in Latin America and the Caribbean confirmed this result. In every decade, more than 60% of the added population was accommodated in expansion areas and less than 40% in the existing urban footprints at the beginning of the decade. These results confirm the proposition that however successful future densification policies may be, a significant share of future urban growth will have to be accommodated by urban expansion. The fourth guideline. Yes, densification is greener than expansion and definitely greener than business as usual expansion, as amply demonstrated in the excellent Weight of Cities report. But it cannot replace expansion. The only green option available to growing cities is to make urban expansion green. This can be accomplished, as we shall see later, by several means. I outline them here. It can be accomplished by connecting expansion areas to the urban labor market by a grid of arterial roads that can carry public transport within walking distance of women. By enabling and encouraging high-density, transit-oriented development along these arterial roads, by promoting mixed land use, by protecting drainage channels from development, by guiding development away from flood-prone areas, steep slopes, sensitive natural habitats, and high-value environmental assets. It can also be accomplished by ensuring that neighborhoods contain adequate public open spaces and by planning for small blocks with four-way intersections that facilitate walking and biking. The fifth guideline. Come to terms with the fact that unplanned and disorderly expansion is undesirable. Evidence is accumulating that the expansion areas of cities have worse urban fabrics than those in the areas of cities built earlier. In a global sample of cities, the share of the built-up area within walking distance of arterial roads decreased from 83% in areas built before 1990 to 69% in areas built between 1990 and 2015. Average block sizes increased as well during the 1990-2015 period in cities in the global north from 4.2 to 6.2 hectares and in cities in the global south from 3.5 to 5.1 hectares. And the share of neighborhoods that are properly subdivided before they are built declined in all world regions. This should be a cause for concern. Once an area is built up, pushing an arterial road through it is both politically and economically infeasible and therefore rarely happens. Professor Abiko and his colleagues have shown that providing infrastructure services in informal settlements, like the favelas in Brazil, for example, costs 3 to 6 times more than providing them before home building takes place. Disorderly and haphazard urban expansion blocks drainage channels, increases the risk of collapse from landslides, increases the risk of flooding, and fails to protect areas of environmental risk or to provide adequate public open spaces. The sixth guideline. Seek to empower local officials and stakeholders to plan and implement expansion themselves. The mayor of Gabile in Somaliland, at the completion of a 2022 workshop on urban expansion planning, had this to say: "Now, we not only have a long-term urban expansion plan for our city, but we also know how to do it by ourselves, and this is exactly what we need." There are two working models for making plans for urban expansion: the empowerment model and the consultancy model. The consultancy model involves creating a plan as a deliverable, often by technical cooperation experts from the global north, getting paid and moving on. In 2002, for example, Japan's development aid budget totaled $9.3 billion. Of this, $2.8 billion, or 30%, was in technical cooperation and stayed in Japan. Technical cooperation increases the knowledge and expertise of consulting firms, typically in the global north, largely at the expense of city officials in the global south who gain little knowledge or expertise. We at New York University, NYU, have been dedicated to making the empowerment model work since 2012, working with local officials in Colombia and Ethiopia, for example, who have made and implemented plans for their orderly expansion. The picture shown here is of municipal officials from Bahir Dar, Ethiopia, drafting a long-term plan for the expansion of their city at the 2013 workshop organized by NYU in Addis Ababa. To assist officials like those of Bahir Dar in planning for accommodating growth, both by densification and by expansion, we have recently completed an online course in partnership with Urban Shift. The course, titled Accommodating Urban Growth, is presented in the form of some 120 short 3 to 4 minute videos or an accompanying text. It is now freely available online in 6 languages. The Director of Planning and Development for Blantyre, Malawi, who took the online course, commented, "I went through it twice. I found everything to be very relevant." To conclude, empowerment has to do with what we call in architecture, who is holding the pencil. Who should be making the plan? The foreign consultant, armed with the latest globalized knowledge, or local officials who understand the situation on the ground and, provided with simple tools they can master, can make the plans they really need? The 7th guideline. Empower local officials and stakeholders to make realistic projections of the amount of land needed to accommodate growth in the coming decades, preferably for 30 years. There are now, for the first time, global data sources for both population and built-up areas for all human settlements. There are at least 3 global population grids with 100-meter resolution. Landscan, published by the Oak Ridge National Laboratory and shown here, GHS POP of the European Commission, and World POP, published by the University of Southampton. There are at least 2 global built-up area grids, GHSL Built of the European Commission, shown in this map, and the World Settlement Footprint, WSF, of the German Space Agency, DLR. Both provide historical data. The former provides data going back to 1975, and the latter going back to 2000. There's also a comprehensive data set with census data for several periods for all cities at citypopulation.de, albeit without identifying their physical extent. And finally, there's the UN Population Division's World Urbanization Prospects, with urban population for all countries from 1950 to 2050. All of these global data sets still have serious issues that will need to be sorted out, but they are improving all the time. These data sets already provide adequate information for projecting both population and average urban density into the future, making it possible to calculate the amount of land needed for urban expansion for every city in the coming decades. Going forward, together with partners from the World Resources Institute, WRI, we're now working to create an Atlas of Urban Growth, a complementary tool to the online course on accommodating urban growth mentioned earlier. The Atlas would provide easy access to free online maps and metrics of historical urban expansion, topography, and environmental hazards, and environmental assets as well, for all 50,000 cities that now have 10,000 people or more, and in as many as 50 languages. The main function of the Atlas is to make the data already available but rather difficult to use globally accessible to municipal officials in cities everywhere so that they can make their own urban expansion plans. The 8th guideline. Because projecting too little land will result in costly unplanned expansion, while preparing too much land will cost little if preparations are minimal, advocate for erring on the side of projecting more rather than less land for expansion. There are 3 truly visionary plans for generous urban expansion at scale, all of them quite old. The 1811 Commissioner's Plan for New York City, Ildefons Cerda's 858 Ensanche Plan for Barcelona, and James Hobrecht's 1872 Expansion Plan for Berlin. In their comments on the plan, the New York commissioners remarked, and I quote, "To some, it may be a matter of surprise that the whole island has not been laid out as a city. To others, it may be a subject of merriment that the commissioners have provided space for a greater population that is collected at any spot on this side of China. Ildefons-Cerdà's 858 ensanche plan for Barcelona expanded the planned area of the city tenfold from 200 to 2,000 hectares. James Hobrecht's 1872 plan for Berlin expanded the city at least fivefold in all directions. The plans for all three cities were implemented on the ground, and ambitious as they were, all three cities grew far beyond them. That said, these three classic plans provide ample evidence that planning for urban expansion at scale is both feasible and possible. More recently, visionary urban leaders in the Global South have taken those examples to heart. At an urban planning workshop recently organized by Cities Alliance, Dr. Sanya Wilson, the mayor of Koboko, Uganda, observed, and I quote, "In 2016, Koboko was 20 square kilometers. When I came back from the urban planning workshop in Addis Ababa, I said, we're going to go the Ethiopian way, we're going to plan beyond, and I want to see the Koboko municipality area expanded by 80%. Now I have 108 square kilometers of Koboko, which is planned, and we called it peri-urban planning. You will never stop urbanization. I'm doing a favor to the leaders of Koboko that will come after me." The ninth guideline: help the city identify the lands on the urban periphery that are suitable for expansion, ensuring that drainage channels, steep slopes, low-lying areas subject to sea level rise, and important environmental assets can be protected from development. It is important to realize at the outset that simply mapping no-build zones on maps that decorate the walls of municipal offices is not enough. Here's one example: the 1999 zoning map for San Salvador. By 2001, the new built-up areas in the planning zones designated maximum protection and unsafe to build was more than twice the new built-up area in the zone designated urban area. Similarly, protecting drainage channels, steep slopes, flood zones, or high-value environmental assets from urban development, and particularly from informal settlement, requires a more profound understanding of why such development happens. In most cases, it happens because these areas are more accessible to the urban job market and because there's a shortage of affordable yet green formal plots with good access to the job market. The key is to plan for an adequate supply of affordable yet green plots to reduce demand for informal plots and to guide development there with arterial roads that carry public transport and provide good access to the urban job market. The 10th guideline: help plan an arterial road grid throughout the projected expansion area. 30-meter wide roads, 1 kilometer apart, that can carry public transport within women's walking distance and connect workers to jobs, and mark the rights of way for the grid. Look at this Google map of Toronto. It has a grid of arterial roads 1 mile or half-mile apart. Now look at this map. There's a transit line on every one of these arterial roads. Toronto has the third largest transit system in North America, much facilitated by its arterial road grid. An arterial road grid becomes more gender sensitive when roads are within walking distance of women, possibly carrying bags or caring for others. This is why we recommend arterial grids that are 1 kilometer apart, not 1 mile apart. Local officials in Mekelle, Ethiopia, participated in an NYU workshop in 2013 where they prepared a draft arterial road grid plan for their city. They later finalized the plan and implemented large parts of it. This is an area in the southwest periphery of Mekelle showing the development of macroblocks within its arterial road grid in 2024. In October 2023, high officials from Malawi participated in a workshop in New York University where they prepared draft plans for the expansion of 3 of the largest cities in the country, Lilongwe, Blantyre, and Zomba. The draft plan for Blantyre is shown in this map. There are now plans in the making for a pilot project in Malawi aimed at finalizing one or more of these draft plans into engineering plans, identifying the roads right of way in high-resolution satellite imagery, surveying them on the ground, and marking them with beacons spaced 100 meters apart on both sides. In Valledupar, Colombia, parts of the future arterial road grid shown here were marked with trees along their future sidewalks. The 11th guideline. Reform zoning and land use regulations to allow for green urban expansion, permitting high-density, transit-oriented corridors along arterial roads, mixed use within macro blocks, smaller plots, and higher plot coverage, and requiring neighborhood greens. The planning of an arterial road grid that can carry public transport, buses, and later bus rapid transit as well, can help greening expansion if regulations are put in place that allow and encourage high-density mixed-use development along these arterial roads. This may require changing existing regulations to allow for higher floor area ratios, larger plots, higher plot coverage, or parking behind buildings to allow for the formation of walkable streets lined with shops. The zoning and land use regulations should aim at the proper layout and subdivision of macro blocks into streets and plots, allowing for and encouraging their conversion one by one from rural to urban use. These regulations need to be simple and transparent and employed with affordability in mind. They should aim to compete with informal settlements, offering an attractive alternative to persistent informality. This slide shows a model macro block developed for Ethiopian cities based on a regulatory framework that allows high-density mixed use along its periphery, parking behind buildings, markets along the arterial roads, small blocks with a variety of residential plot sizes, small public open spaces, and public facilities in the center. In November 2023, Cities Alliance organized a high-level peer learning event focused on learning about urban expansion planning from Mekelle in Ethiopia. The participants included state ministers from Ethiopia and Uganda, regional government representatives, mayors and municipal officials, and academics from Ethiopia, Uganda, and Somaliland. At the completion of the high-level peer learning event, participants drafted and adopted the Mekelle Declaration of Cities. The declaration resolves, among other things, to put in place or review relevant legal and regulatory frameworks to facilitate preparation and implementation of urban expansion planning. The 12th guideline. Promote and empower rural councils and landowners to implement land pooling and subdivision within macro blocks of the arterial road grid to reduce demand for informal settlements, capture the increased land value, and provide affordable plots. Converting macro blocks from rural to urban use, one macro block at a time, provides a pragmatic way of implementing planned urban expansion at scale. The key is to understand that the proper division into streets and plots makes all the difference between a place that develops as an irregular informal settlement and a place that develops into a regular urban neighborhood. In other words, land subdivision is an antidote to informality. Most of the new construction on the periphery of cities in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, is informal. Informality is characterized by rural landholders on the urban periphery breaking up their rural land holdings and selling them piece by piece to families who then build starter houses on them. Basic amenities such as streets, water supply, sewerage, drainage, and public open spaces are not provided. Sales lack a proper land survey as well as official documentation, and houses do not conform to the municipal building code. Informality typically happens when rural landholders are not directly involved in the official conversion of lands from rural to urban use and are threatened by the prospect of their lands being expropriated. The resulting absence of proper street layouts greatly increases the cost of the provision of infrastructure services later. The absence of proper documentation increases the threat of eviction, and the resulting insecurity of tenure delays investments of both savings and labor in house improvement. What is more, the irregular layout of informal neighborhoods often imposes on them the stigma of being a slum, which is difficult to shed over time. The best counterexample I know is Comas, a 1960s squatter invasion on the periphery of Lima, Peru. The only difference between Comas and other squatter settlements is that the land was properly subdivided before it was occupied. Each squatter family received a 10 by 20 meter plot along 10-meter wide streets, and plots were reserved for markets, parks, and schools. Families built a shack in the middle of the plot overnight, immediately following the invasion, and then quickly dug channels along the plot boundaries to mark their territory. They then gradually built brick walls around their plots and rooms facing inwards. In 2024, houses in Comas were selling for as much as $180,000. In a proposed pilot project in Malawi, we're envisioning the development of 3 macro blocks, one after the other, using land pooling and subdivision, also called land readjustment, as the mechanism for converting rural land to urban use. This mechanism has been used extensively in the past in Germany, Japan, and Australia, for example, and more recently in Ahmedabad in India. In essence, the original owners get back a share of their original lands in the form of saleable plots with proper title documents, while the remaining land is used for streets and open spaces, as well as for funding basic infrastructure. In Ahmedabad, 4.5 square kilometers of land for the 76-kilometer-long Sardar Patel Ring Road around the city were developed through land pooling and subdivision in 4 years. This involved 47 town planning schemes along the ring road alignment, each one involving land pooling and subdivision as shown in this map. It is envisioned that the Malawi pilot project will focus on developing 3 adjacent macro blocks in one of the largest cities in the country. This is expected to create 4,500 saleable residential plots and 500 mixed-use plots. At the conclusion of an October 2023 workshop for Malawi officials at NYU, Chief Kapecha Kalumbo, the chairperson of the Lilongwe Chiefs Council, commented that he originally was resistant to urban expansion as he thought it would just be used to take away the rights of traditional landowners. He now understood that the cities are going to expand, whether the council plans for it or not, so that advanced land subdivision would be the best method to get ahead of expansion. He feels that he was now better able to explain to people in his community that cities can expand while still respecting local communities. I found this very encouraging and heartwarming. And this brings my presentation to an end. Thank you.